Welcome to A State of Mind. I'm Paul John Dykes, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Stuart Cosgrove. Stuart,
Paul,
welcome
good
to
to
the show.
see you after all this time.
It's great. It's
Yeah,
great to
good
have
to
you on
be
the
here.
show.
Yeah.
And we're here obviously to speak about Hey America.
We are indeed, yeah.
But these previous books will lead us into that.
Yes.
Because I think that once you've worked your way through, certainly these four, and obviously
Yeah.
Cash's Sex as well,
Yeah.
it's no surprise that Hey America comes along as well.
Correct,
and
yeah.
it again bonds in a lot of the themes that you touched on in these books.
Yes.
We were just talking about education. I think that's a good starting point then.
Yeah.
How important was your school days to you?
My school days were probably different from my school education. I was quite a resistant and maybe probably a wee bit of a kind of rebellious figure at school. I was quite notorious within the school and didn't really enjoy my secondary schooling. I'd had a wonderful time in my primary school. I was my father died when I was very young, and I was out of school for about a year, and when I came back into school aged 8 or 9, I was at a Catholic school in Perth, and it was largely run by the nuns, and the nuns kind of looked after me. And I remember the day I came back, they'd set up a little kind of, my class and some of the other classes were there to clap me back into the school. And that was the first time I'd ever seen that kind of guard of honour thing. And I felt hugely loved and well kind of respected in the school. And for reasons that I'll not go into the absolute arcane history of it, there wasn't at that time a senior secondary school for Catholic children in Perth where I grew up. The nearest one was in Lawside in Dundee, which is a 22-mile journey, and where I lived in Perth you needed 2 buses to get into the town, and then a train, and then a bus from Dundee station up to Lawside. So the whole journey took you nearly 2 hours every day. And my mum just thought this was ridiculous, and I went up to Perth Academy, which was my nearest school on the hill in Perth there, and I probably didn't enjoy it as much. I don't know why. I thought it was quite kind of a cold school, quite a kind of, controlling school. That being said, by the time I was 15 and 16, I'd got into soul music via the Letham Community Centre Disco, where I lived in Letham and Perth, and that was in the high era of Motown and Stax and ska music, and I was always a kind of suede head or a skinhead or something like that, and I just loved that music. And when I got to the age of 16 going on 17, I did modern studies, and my modern studies teacher, Miss Campbell, Lorna Campbell, who was a woman who'd been teaching in Dundee, had moved through to Perth, and she kind of asked me a wee bit about my interest in Motown, and she started to say to me, well, why don't you actually think about the culture and the politics behind that music, and she actually said to me, why don't you study civil rights? And I said, all right, okay. And she said to me, we'll meet. Now, this is the first time I'd ever heard of this in my life. She said, you'll be in a small seminar group, 5 or 6 of you, other people will be doing the anti-apartheid movement and all that, and there were about 6 of us round the table. And she said to me something like, you'll have a tutorial with me every week where we'll sit and talk about the progress you've made. Now, for me, school was like 30 people in a room and them trying to chuck the duster at the board and all of that. And the idea that you'd sit down with a really, in this case, hugely bright woman and talk to her, and she would send me off the Sandeman Library in Perth, where I would go and find out things about Martin Luther King and subjects like that. Of course, it was also like the kind of Rhodesia crisis, and then ultimately the South African apartheid crisis. It was on the news on a nightly basis for one reason or another, and I just fell in love with this, and I started to connect the music to the politics behind it, and that was a seed that was kind of sown in my mind at a very early age through modern studies. And it was only probably when I was living down in Wigan at the all-nighters in England that I started to write about it as a fanzine writer in the Northern Soul scene. And that actually kind of liberated me to believe that I could write about this subject, not necessarily at that time make a living from it, but write about it and actually edge my way into music journalism.
It's incredible how that has come together, that
Yeah.
merge of politics, the music, and then the scene.
Yeah.
And what I find really interesting about Northern Soul, Stuart, is the tribe.
Yeah.
There is a tribalism, but you're not coming from the same area, from
No.
all over. And as you mentioned, Wigan Casino, the venues, the DJs. Take us into a place like Wigan Casino. We've heard all the stories, we've seen the documentaries. What was it like to be there?
Well, you know, all of these venues had their own individual kind of character, like all clubs and all nightclubs all have their own individual kind of dynamic about them. What was probably special about Wigan Casino, and there had been very big all-nighters that had preceded it, and they were, for example, the biggie was the Twisted Wheel in Manchester, and then the Golden Torch in Stoke-on-Trent, and then there were midweek venues like the Pendulum in Manchester. And I'd been going to all-nighters before Wigan opened. I used to go regularly to one called Vava's in Bolton, and when Wigan opened, it had filled effectively a gap when the Wheel closed because of the Manchester police basically targeting it as a place where amphetamine was bought and sold and where drugs were being taken. They targeted the Twisted Wheel. The Twisted Wheel was at number 1 Whitfield Street in Manchester, directly opposite where the police station was. And I think that there was a bit about the Manchester police that resented this thing happening literally right in front of their eyes. They couldn't bear it, and they targeted the nightclub, closed it down, and then eventually the Torch in Stoke-on-Trent fell for similar reasons. There was a lot of pressure on it from the police. And when Wigan opened, it was like a new opening, but it was in a very old building, a kind of old ballroom. It had the sprung wooden floor that you associate with Great Northern Soul dancing. It had this kind of arena around it, almost like a kind of balcony, and then this stage where the DJs were on, and they were positioned slightly to the kind of left of the stage, and the stage was actually quite big. It was a full theatrical stage, but they were to the left of it, and I danced right in front of them. The reasoning I danced right in front of them wasn't because I was necessarily a good dancer. I was a competent, decent enough dancer. I wasn't looking for attention from DJs, but there was a little set of steps right next to the stage steps basically, and I used to be able to run up there if there was a record I didn't know and look on the deck and watch it going round and round and round, and I was really, really good at decoding, right, because a lot of records were either A, covered up, or B, were on labels that weren't necessarily known to you, and sometimes you couldn't even guess where the record was from. But I was good at working on area code brackets 313, that's a Detroit area code. I'd had a big list of these kind of things, so I knew where Baltimore was in Detroit, and I would say, it's brilliant, it's a Baltimore record, da-da-da-da-da, and that sometimes took you closer to guessing what it was. And I was quite friendly with Richard Serling, the DJ. He was probably the best DJ at Wigan at that time, and he would tell me what his big records were. But I was very close friends with the late, great John Anderson, who was a Scottish record dealer who by this time was down in King's Lynn in Norfolk. And I would travel down to his barn. We had first of all, a big villa that he sold records from, and then over to what became a kind of farm, and the records were in this big barn. And his wife Marissa, they were Glasgow mods who'd relocated down to England, and they had a kind of special place for me because I was a Scottish guy, and I would arrive with all these guys from Burnley or Preston or Rochdale or whatever, and they always kind of gave me sort of privileged status and whatever. He passed away sadly quite recently. I had moved back home to the borders of Scotland, and Stuart, his son, who was named after me, Stuart Anderson, was kind of officiating at the funeral, and quite a lot of the big names were there: Soul Sam, Colin Curtis, Richard Serling, people who are iconic in the Northern Soul scene were at this funeral. And I think that man, John Anderson, probably discovered more great obscure soul records than any single human being in the world. I mean, he was an absolute legend in the scene,
When people discover certain tracks, records, they're going over to record pick in basements over in the States. Tell us about some of the stories you've heard, Stuart, because it is really fanatical once they get into it, isn't it?
Well, okay, so there's a story that I tell in Young Soul Rebel, because I was also a student in Washington, D.C. in particular. John, who I mentioned earlier, the John Anderson, also would hire me as a kind of finder. Hire me. He would say to me, go to this warehouse, check out what's in it, and come back to me, ring me, or get in touch and let me know if it's worth me bidding. And he would buy the whole warehouse, right? So I would go into these warehouses, and the guy would let you through the back of his shop, and it was in a shed maybe, or actually a built warehouse, or next door to the shop in another building. And I would go into them, and I would literally flick through and say, I'm guessing there's 40,000 records in all in this container, of which maybe a third of them are soul and 2/3 of them are country and western or whatever. So I'd give them a breakdown of what's there, and then I would say things like preponderance of black ABC RCA records, so likely copies of Lorraine Chandler, and I'd name big northern records that might reasonably be buried in these things. So that was kind of like my job, and he would buy them and then he would sell them on, and often there were big rare records in there, and some of which I would discover myself. But of course, the thing about the Northern Soul scene is a lot of people have it frozen in time and frozen in an aspect around the kind of 4 or 5 years that Wigan Casino was at its height, when in actual fact the scene had preceded Wigan by 10 years, and obviously 30 odd years after Wigan closed, and the tone, the taste, the mood, the literally the tempo of the music has changed inexorably in those times. And so what was a very, very rare record back at Wigan might then have been discovered in a warehouse in Baltimore, 2,000 copies of it, and it ceases to be as rare as it once was. Other things that maybe an acetate from a studio would be the only one in the world, and therefore hugely rare. So it's a scene that's predicated on the value of records in a number of different ways. How good are they? How good are they to dance to? And of course, the other thing about it is that there's who's produced them, who's singing, who's the vocalist. And I had a lot of people that don't know an awful lot about the Northern Soul scene. I used to say things like, well, if these records have died and they're hopeless and no one wanted to buy them, it's because they're not very good. But in actual fact, in the Northern Soul scene, they were mostly highly regionalised, localised to a single city. They were often African-American owned labels or companies in areas, often in kind of inner city or ghetto areas of a city. The band maybe had the ability to go into a studio with only maybe 4 hours that they could afford to lay down a track, and then to get it published, they could only afford to print up 250 copies of the record. And they had no money to promote it, so they would go down to local DJs, try and get it played in the local radio station, and sooner or later 200 of them just simply disappeared, gave some to their cousin, their brother, left one in an attic somewhere, and these records just over 30 years become massively rare. It doesn't mean they're not good, it means that the capital system of vinyl exchange didn't kind of give them any attention. They weren't played on radio, they weren't sold in big stores, and therefore if you think that the only things that are good in the world are things that sell, then I think you need to go back to kindergarten.
I'm looking at how the scenes change with technology, and the fact that you've got a lot of the kind of older heads from the Northern Soul scene who can access things online.
Yes.
How important was the fanzine scene to
the fanzine
Northern
scene? The fanzine scene was vital because it was the only means other than human conversation. There was a record mart at the back of Wigan Casino, right at the very back of the hall, and it was kind of in what was effective. I think it was probably a kind of soft drinks bar or something like that, and the let record collectors put their boxes up on the counter, and I used to go in there, trestle tables full of records and that, and I would spend a good hour and a half in there, and you were meeting up some of the characters that became collector legends and all the rest of it. It was quite intimidating at times because you were often going in there knowing that some of the big brains were in the room, you know what I mean? And I was a bright guy, academically, I was at university. I was seen as quite a kind of like knowledgeable guy. I was a collector, but you would go in there and sometimes feel really, really, really intimidated. So a really interesting lesson about the whole idea of knowledge, because sometimes the brightest guys in the room were things like gas fitters from Rochdale, or, a guy who was a builder's mate. I mean, I had a guy, a really, really good friend of mine, Ali Cragen, who was a scaffolder, and he kept winning scaffolding competitions for his company, and he was seen as one of Britain's top scaffolders, but he had some of the best records ever that were played at Blackpool Mecca. And when I went into those kinds of rooms, you were always slightly intimidated by knowledge, by people that knew the labels intricately, that had stored knowledge also about producers, arrangers' names that they'd recorded over maybe about 8 records. And I always remember the thing that really, really got me going, and to this day is one of the things I most love about Northern Soul. I remember going into the bar at Wigan, and there was a guy that just had a tattoo, and on the tattoo were the letters ZTSC, ZTSC. And if you ever said to anybody, ZTSC, what exactly is that? And I remember a guy saying to me, it's cool soul producers putting that on their label, hoping that we'll give them the attention they've not had in America. It's like a cry for help and all the rest of it. And this ZTSC seemed to recur over numerous really, really big records on the northern scene, quite a lot of the kind of Detroit labels, a few Chicago labels. And so it became very, very odd as to why ZTSC kept cropping up. And if you looked in the dead wax, literally the run out groove, as it were, of a record just before the label, you'd often see either stamped or scrolled in it, handwritten with maybe a little, a pin or something, the letters ZTSC. So it became this really kind of rich myth within the scene. As it transpired, what had happened was that Columbia Records had their main Northwest pressing plant in a place called Oswego in Michigan, so just north of Detroit, on the way up to Chicago. And that plant's plant reference within the Columbia system was ZTSC. That was just simply their plant. But and they did a deal, they had this thing for local indies that they would print their records for them, publish them. 200, come and get your record next Tuesday, they'll be ready, the vinyl in the box or whatever. And of course, inevitably, because they were pressed in that plant, they carried the ZTSC logo. And that therefore meant that records that were produced between 1965 and 72 in Detroit, in Chicago, and in, say, Toledo, Ohio, were likely to carry that signifying mark. But that took me, literally 2 decades to find out what it really meant, even although I'd spread the myth that it was some kind of mythical communication from the gods of Northern Soul.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
I look at this book, correct me if I'm wrong, is this like a love letter to soul music from you, Stuart?
Yeah, and there are 2 versions of that. The first version, which is really hard to get now, contained an awful lot more photographs. So that's the pared down version, and that's sold out as well. So I'm actually thinking of going back and redoing the big version, because a lot of people write to me saying, I saw a guy showed me it, and I'm sure there's a photograph in it in me, but I bought it and there's no photographs. I'm going, you've got the basically, and you've got the press and you've got the bootleg, mate, you've not got the original. So I kind of would love to see that coming back out again. Is it a love letter? Yeah, it's got a kind of biography about it, and it also tries to explain, without being overly pretentious, where my, what's the best way of putting this, where my obsessions feed in and why they're commensurate with Northern Soul. I remember that, I tell the story about my father dying and having sent me this postcard of Yuri Gagarin. He'd been in Russia with his trade union, and when he came back, he was killed on a Sunday in a car crash going to a strike in Forfar. And he'd sent me this postcard of Yuri Gagarin from Moscow, and it arrived after he was dead. So for me, this was the most precious thing in the world. And I kind of understood I explained through that why there's a kind of preciousness about collecting, how it can have a value and what it really means, and what being, because I remember taking it to school and people hadn't seen a Russian stamp, guys were crowding around the playground. It was the first real buzz I remember getting, thinking, I've got an object that they all want, but it's mine, and that feeds one of the kind of great Northern Soul things about collectability. And I've always been, I don't like using the word having a kind of autistic mind, but I'm a great, I like having things in their order and their shape and their place, and and I like seeing things to be, so I would be one of the guys that would say, I collect all Yellow Label music, and then eventually I would say everything out of Baltimore, then it would be everything out of Washington DC, 6 mile from the White House. I could go on and on about the obsessions I've had with soul music, and I struggle to sell records. I buy like hell, so they just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and I need therefore a shape to keep them in. So I'll have a box that says records over $2,000 in the market, or records that have got a Detroit rare label kind of heritage or whatever. So there's a tendency in the Northern Soul scene, because it's quite a list-based scene, you always have a wants list, and I should have brought my little wants book in, what I've had since I was about 19, and you can see I cross out ones when I get it, and there's still ones there that defy me, and they'll maybe defy me at the day I die. But the idea of having a wants list and keeping things in order and shape, it's a big Northern Soul thing,
What I find incredible as well, Stuart, we've spoken to a few real collectors who have collected for decades, and they get to the stage and they sell their entire collection. Is that you? Could you do that?
I could do that. My current collection, the one that I've got over in Denniston, where I live now in Glasgow, is worth significantly more than my house. The records are worth more than the house. So they're boxed up in a lockbox, and the lockbox is padlocked in the house, a cupboard in the house, which my wee boy's not allowed anywhere near, and he would need to literally take an axe to get in it. I just don't trust him with it yet. Eventually I will. But yeah, if I sold that, it would produce quite a lot of money, and quite a lot of it I was buying at the time when there were records that came into, or when I was out collecting, when I was a student, and you could walk into a junk shop and find something that at the time was worth 30 quid, and you thought, wow, 30 quid, that's for a record, and then you find out now it's 300 and then 3,000, and the value of Northern Soul has increased, not decreased. And I think that there's a number of different reasons for that. If you go back to me being at Wigan, I would go into the back record room at the very back of the dance hall, and the maybe 20 guys that were in there trading were the 20 people that you bought and sold from. And then there was a few lists that would come out during the week, and they were kind of people that were trying to make them, trying to make money out of buying and selling records. Now on the auction lists, if some like Rare Soul Man John Manship's auction on a Wednesday, it's collectors from all over the world. Quite a lot of them are American, some lot Scandinavian, from Germany, from Japan, and these people wouldn't have been in Wigan in that room simply for geographical reasons. So actually the web has opened up new markets to the value of Northern Soul, and the records are, as a consequence of that, worth more. So there's a record that I had about 8 copies of it, because I found it when I was out in the States, called You're the Gold of My Life. Mixed Emotions is by You're the Gold of My Life on Rockaway Records. And the B-side of it, or what we would consider a B-side, the non-Northern Soul side of it, is a huge record on the US kind of student funk scene. And so you got 2 people bidding on the same record, even although they're from different cultures and scenes and things like that. Equally, it's the case that quite a lot of Japanese guys bid on the ballad side of an up-tempo Northern record, because the singer's maybe done a ballad on the B-side. And the one that's becoming more and more common is the low rider scene, Hispanic collectors that are looking for kind of kind of mid-pace, what we would call floaters, records that were big in, places like Blackpool, Mecca. They're kind of mid-paced great soul records, and they're known as lowrider records in the Hispanic scene. So they would bid on, so it's opened up this entire kind of rich seam of music collecting, and therefore has made the records even more in demand than they would have been in the 70s,
Incredible. When I look at this trilogy, I think to myself, as a writer, that must have been a huge undertaking.
Yeah.
You've written about the last 3 years of the 1960s, and what I find incredible, you're talking about how the authorities, and in particular the police, they get frightened with any scene, Stuart, where people come together and they try and shut it down. But a lot of the music was written as a reaction to the authorities and oppression. So it's come full circle.
Yeah.
Talk us through these three magnificent books.
Okay, these three books are Detroit 67, Memphis 68, and Harlem 69, The Future of Soul. And as you say, there are three books that are kind of books about cities, in the case Detroit, Memphis, and Harlem and New York, and they're books about the city's music and cultural and political scene across those years. So if you looked at Detroit 67, it's one of the most eventful years in the history of the city, and the city in each of these books is the central character, although within the city there are endless other kind of significant characters that return or recur, and I've got a way of writing. A lot of people refer to it as novelistic, in the sense that you're not quite sure, it's descriptive. You're not quite sure if these are characters in a novel or characters in a real history. It's all pretty much accurate. I mean, there are probably a couple of things where I've made adjustments of time in order for an event to coincide with another event, whatever, but by and large they're honest and factual. I was going, my mate Mike, who went to the same primary school as me and who I've known since I was a child, and who's a big soul collector as well, we had gone together to see, we'd gone to see Dreamgirls. It come out as a movie, and we were both in London at the time, and I said, why don't you go and see Dreamgirls with a spare night? So we were going to see Dreamgirls, and as we were coming out, he said to me, do you think Florence Ballard, who was the character that's called Effie in the film, played by Jennifer Holliday, and he said, do you think she really got sacked at the height of the Detroit riots? And I'm going, don't know, but I'll find out, right? And that was the trigger for that to begin with. I was thinking of a subject. I was about to start looking for an exit from Channel 4, where I'd worked for 20 odd years. And the next time he saw me, he came into my flat in London, and I had this back bedroom, and right round the room were post-it notes, and it would be where the Four Tops were in March the 3rd, where the Temptations were, when the riots began, when they ended, what other major events happened in the year. And I was able to sketch out day to day, I mean literally from the 1st of January to the 31st of December, the main events in the city of Detroit. And I was out there reading Detroit newspapers for a period of weeks and months, and I'd almost got to the stage, because by then it's quite hard to find rare records in America now. A lot of the places have been cleaned and skimmed and whatever, and I spent a bit of time at People's Records in Detroit, but you know what, I looked through it and I thought, well, you know what, I can get a lot of this anytime I want, and they've not got uber rare stuff, so I spent more time in the library than I spent in record shops, and learned a lot about the city of Detroit. And it's the great Detroit novelist, Elmore Leonard, probably Detroit's greatest crime writer. He does a crime writing class for student writers, and he always says, number one rule of writing a great novel, never ever start with the weather. That's his kind of number one thing. And he goes on to explain why that is the case. On the first day of January 1967, Detroit was beset with the worst snowstorm in its history. And I had to say, sorry, Elmer Leonard, I'm fucking starting with the weather. So the first chapter's called Snow, and it's fortuitous in a number of ways, because everybody's trapped in their own homes. And as a writer, that gives you an opportunity then to imagine some of the things that they might have been engaging with in their mind. So there is a degree of novelistic interpretation there. But if you take someone like Berry Gordy, I set up what the big issues that he was facing in his company were that year, and looking forward to trouble within the Supremes, a crisis around what to do with Marvin Gaye, who was his brother-in-law, and a number of things like that. So I was imagining what was in Berry Gordy's mind, but it was pretty good also at describing his home, which I'd peered through the windows of. I'd actually gone up to at that time he was living in a place on Outer Drive in Monica. It's a kind of cross section in Detroit, and I remember going there one day, got a taxi up, and I'd been at the library. It was about 11 or whatever, and I went right up the door and I rang the door. No answer, and it's since probably been bought by a family who it's their local family home. And I thought, right, I'll just look through. So I was literally looking through. I got my phone, was taking photographs of the inside of their house. And there are certain things about the outside that must have been the same when Gordy lived there. So you see the description of the snow on the outside of the house, which is hugely accurate because it is the house and I'd photographed it and whatever. So I'll go to quite kind of extraordinary lengths to find detail as well.
But you already had that with your soul collecting.
Yeah,
that attention to detail.
Kind of where it is, and kind of obsessive, and the idea that you can map out little bits of pieces of knowledge and things like that.
What I also loved, particularly looking at the '69, is the influence that hip hop in the 1990s have taken from these types of labels.
That book, the Harlem one, literally was the seeds of hip hop. You know, you can see at the end of 1969 a number of record labels, a couple of venues, and them beginning to sow the seeds of what we now know as hip hop. I mean, hip hop probably didn't surface until the early mid 70s in the South Bronx, but in Harlem you can see some of I write a lot about Fat Jack Taylor, who owned Rojack Records in Harlem, and he set up Harlem World, one of the great hip hop venues in New York, and the characters that were his producers were eventually the first generation of hip-hop producers as well. So, you can see almost the reason that the Harlem book's called The Future of Soul is a point to the origins of disco, club music, electronic dance music, and hip-hop, and they are kind of future tributaries of soul music, if you like.
Absolutely. I mean, even the Hacienda and the Manchester movement and the DJs and what they were playing at that time were hugely influenced. I'm going to take a wee sidestep before we get into your latest book, Stuart. Talking of hip-hop, what's your thoughts on the Scottish and Irish hip-hop scene at the moment?
Well, I'm obviously, as you know, somebody that supports Scotland even when they're shite, so there is a side of me that kind of has always willed Scottish hip hop to be a thing, in much the same way I've supported Scottish, original, authentic, traditional Scottish music or Scottish pop and rock as well, and that's kind of out of a kind of inherent sort of patriotism about Scotland. If I was brutally honest with you, I don't hold out a torch for it the way that I do for old school in kind of Harlem and the Bronx and all of that. And there is still a little bit of me that kind of sees hip hop as that, rather than even urban music, because whilst I consider Beyonce and John Legend and people like that to be legends, I don't see them as hip hop. I see them as urban musicians who are using literally picking influences from it wherever they feel they need to or they can. So I like old school Bronx hip hop and the kind of characters that emerge from that. I even feel by the time the kind of LA East Coast West Coast wars has happened, there's still a wee bit of me cheering on the hip hop guys from the old school. I've got this 12-inch record box that my girlfriend bought for me as a birthday present. She happened to be walking past a record store in London, and they were selling their whole kit there. I mean, literally, they were selling the counters, they were selling the till, everything was out for sale. And it was a 12-inch record box for K-Rob, the Harlem or Bronx, I can't remember if he's Harlem or Bronx, but anyway, old school New York rapper, and he had his label, 12-inch record label, and boxes to promote it done by Basquiat, the great kind of American artists. So Jean-Michel Basquiat's style, very recognisable, and it was on the box. It was a promotional box for the 12. So she bought me that, and it's one of the few things that I'm allowed to have in the front room because it looks like an objet d'art, and she's quite proud of it being an art find of hers. Whereas if I was to bring all the northern things on when the neighbours were around, she'd be like, "Get them upstairs," you know.
Lock them away.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that although the authorities try and shut down the movements when there's a coming together and a tribalistic element to it, those in power do align themselves with what's popular, and often that is music, and that's a big theme of your latest book, Stuart.
Yeah, because it certainly is, and Hey America's, obviously it's wider in scale because it follows all the presidents really from Eisenhower through to Biden now, and follows those kind of, if you like, those junctures, those moments of tension, or kind of where the music takes on a kind of often an oppositional role, or it tells the stories obviously of on the cover there of James Brown's relationship with Richard Milhouse Nixon. It talks obviously about Black Lives Matter, about the first chapter's called The Audacity of Soul, and the triumph of Barack Obama's Chicago culture coming into the White House and opening the doors to black music like never before. And of course the final chapter ends up with a war over 4 or 5 square mile of Washington DC at the high end of the departure of Donald Trump, and the Black Lives Matter versus Make America Great Again movement. And so the book's very rich in terms of finding intersections between specific presidencies and the politics and culture of the music. But one thing I wanted to talk to you about, because I know it's something that you've been working on previously, you've mentioned Manchester, and you've talked before we came on mic about having interviewed Dave Haslam, who I worked with at the NME as well. And there's a very, very interesting thing that I started talking about, the Twisted Wheel in Whitworth Street in Manchester. It was number 1 Whitworth Street, backs onto what is now the kind of gay area of Canal Street in Manchester. And I have always vowed that there would be a smart, modern and contemporary media company that would see the value of this. You can do the entire history of black dance music in Britain without ever leaving Whitworth Street. If you start at number 1, that's where the Twisted Wheel was, and then of course Canal Street with a kind of gay disco scene. But if you move further along, you reach just next to Oxford Road, you come across the Ritz, which is still there as a traditional ballroom, but in the 1970s was probably the biggest northern soul dance music, DJ kind of, even disco kind of club. Easily one of the biggest, where the Mecca and the Wigan would come together on a Sunday, and that was an all-dayer, probably the biggest all-dayer in the history of the northern soul scene. And then if you move further along, of course, you come to the Hacienda, further along Whitworth Street. So an enterprising company with cameras and audio equipment could do the history of British dance music without leaving that street. You would
Noted.
Noted, yeah. And Dave Haslam can do one end and I'll do the other.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Yeah. And when you're talking about the relationships between politics and black music, I often find that a lot of the big popular artists don't have anything to say. Is that disappointing for you?
Yes, and it's disappointing for a number of different reasons. But the reason I find it most disappointing is, I've interviewed numerous people. So if you take, for example, Martha Reeves of Martha and the Vandellas, I think I've interviewed her maybe 6 times in my life at different stages. And every time I interview Martha Reeves, she tells me stories which I know to be fiction, or which I know to be myth, So she will say at some stage, "Oh, God, take me back to those days, 67 in Detroit. Wow, we were one big happy family." And then I'm like, "Martha, you sued Motown on 3 separate occasions. That cannot be true." But they've built this powerful myth around them, which maybe they need to believe, of happiness, of great childhoods, of we were poor but ... And Scottish people do that all the time. You see people in Scotland all the time talking about how great Glasgow was when there were slums, and you're thinking, really? Can you not see that there's a contradiction there? But people yearn for that idea when life was simpler, and it became more complicated as the years and the decades evolved. And therefore I find that an awful lot of musicians who've maybe done 30,000 interviews in their life, 4 a day when they're on tour, and they maybe come to somewhere. I mean, last time I spoke to Martha Reeves, she was doing a show in Ayr, right? And she probably had 3 local journalists looking for stories about Motown for, the Ayr Advertiser or something like that. And I turn up and I'm like, all right, I'm going to ask her questions she doesn't normally get. She's kind of like slightly bemused. And what they do is they get into a mode of answering. And that mode becomes, all bands will tell you, somebody asks you about this, just tell them blah, just tell them blah. You get some bands that will turn around and say, roll in any old kind of garbage and see if they print it, right? What's been the most exciting day of your life? Oh, I remember once we were doing a show in Florida and we were attacked by pythons on stage. They came out of somebody's luggage, and it's horse shit. They've made it up because they're bored with the interviews. So there's quite a lot of that going on. But I felt with the Motown people, or the high soul people of the 60s, they'd actually built around themselves a whole set of memories or mythologies around the city at the time, and they don't really want to talk about the riots over the summer of 1967. They've got very kind of vague and thin memories of it, and they're never as big as we were one big happy family. We used to sing together on the street corners. No, that was the 1950s. It's myth.
It's mythology. When you look at the collection of books, there's obviously 6 in total, isn't there?
Yes.
I do remember reading the Scottish Football Babylon many years ago.
Yeah, poor soul, you've suffered.
It was a while back.
Yeah.
But these 6 books, I look at them and I think to myself, I'm a massive fan of things like Netflix. And
yeah.
These are built for that.
Yes, they are, and in lots of ways, the company I run in here, Boy 313, is particularly that. It's working on projects that we've got a very big project we're currently involved in that we're selling to America, and I've had all of these books in their direct order have been acquired or purchased, or the rights of them secured by everything from documentary companies to drama companies, American, British, Irish, numerous various deals on all of the books. And the one that probably is the most kind of recurring, so for example, in this one, Detroit 67, if you read the August chapter of this, it's the same story as Catherine Bigelow's film Detroit. If you read the August chapter of Harlem 69, that's the same story as Questlove's The Summer of Soul, which won the Oscar this year. So the books have kind of either influenced big films or have been in the same rich territory as big films, and all of them currently are under kind of rights ownership. So the trilogy, Detroit, Memphis and Harlem, are under, I think I've got another 9 months of them being owned by a company, and then they revert back to me again. And if they've not got things made, then it's up to me to sell them again or get things made. I've had about 4 bids on Hey America. We won't close on that because it's only just out this week. We won't close on that for another couple of months and look at maybe setting an auction date and see what people bid for or whatever. So they're all very, very in demand for film and dramas.
Well, the final question I ask everybody who's a fan, a collector, a DJ of soul music is...
The answer's St. Johnson.
St. Johnson, always.
Yeah.
What next for the movement? Where's the next tribe coming from? Because some people tell me that it's still popular and there's a younger generation coming through in other countries in Europe, but not so much in the UK.
You mean in terms of the Northern Soul scene?
Or, keeping it going.
Keeping it going.
Yeah.
Well, the thing about it is you can already see in the Northern Soul scene many much younger DJs turning up and DJing. I wouldn't have thought that was necessarily popular, because I thought the scene might have died out with my generation, but clearly that's not going to happen. And I see a lot more women DJing, a lot more women participating in the key things like collecting, and well, obviously they were always very big in the dance scene, but the dancing, the collecting and the DJing are the three kind of legs to the table, and more women involved in all three of those. I think there's a number of things that if you move to all-nighters in places like Rimini or Berlin, Hamburg, Oslo, you're seeing people that are running very, very well respected all-nighters from countries that were nothing to do with the original industrial north of England. So there's a spread in that respect as well. So all of those things are pretty healthy, I think, for the scene, and the internet's definitely helped. I mean, like all branches of social media, there's division as well. People that don't consider that to be relevant, or why are they even playing records like that? It's not rare enough, or things like that. And they're often just simply people that have no longer going, or they've got a grouse, or they want to freeze it in time and say it was only this and anything else is not that. And at the heart of the Northern Soul scene, let's not forget, there was always dispute, so that's not new. And one of the big disputes, probably the single biggest dispute in the Northern Soul scene is, was it a soul scene or was it a dance scene? And there are some people that say, no, it was kind of like a dance scene, because records like, for example, quite a lot of the big records of, Frankie Valli, for example, was a pop singer, not a soul singer, but he had maybe 3 or 4 records that were quite big in the Northern Soul scene. So there's always been that dispute. I've always been a great advocate of it being a soul scene, and the best records ever on the scene for me were from African American music in that period from 60 through to 80. But there was another split around traditional and modern, and that came about in the kind of 70s. So you would have DJs like, for example, Soul Sam, who were purveyors of kind of music that had a stronger kind of disco element to it, but still very rare, still often 7-inch and kind of rare labels. And that caused a kind of dispute with people who saw it as being traditionally about 60s soul and the Motown kind of on the 4s beat. So you get all of these kind of internal debates in the same way that they exist within the Labour Party, within Brexit, within Scotland, within the Yes movement in Scotland, within Scottish football. Every society that has passion will split in some form or another,
Well, I'll tell you what, it's been a fascinating insight into the scene. You've got a collection of books here. Give us one last look at this, Stuart, and tell everybody who watches what this book is about. Where can we find it?
This is called Hey America. It's my latest book. It's out this week. It's the epic story of black music and the White House. It tells the story of the way in which soul music, and particularly other forms of black music, interfaced with the presidents that occupied the White House. It's a big book. It's a hardback. It's one that your local library will buy for you if you can't afford it. And it's a whacker. I'm pretty proud of it because it's one of these books that is already selling extremely well in hardback, and I suspect will do well out with the UK as well. It's called Hey America, but for those of you that are into your Northern Soul or your rare soul, there's enough in there where I throw in little bon mots or little nods to records that you already know or you would love. So, for example, the last chapter, which looks at Washington DC in the run-up to the war between Black Lives Matter and the Make America Great Again, the Proud Boys, and the assault on the Capitol building, tells also the history of Washington DC soul from the birth of Marvin Gaye to literally to 2 weeks ago. And of course, dotted in there and peppered in there are some of the rarest Washington DC records you could ever imagine. So for beard strokers everywhere, it's a must buy.
Fantastic, Stuart. Thanks for your time.
Cheers.